right, so today we're really diving into a tough one, this whole thing about the purpose of prison. Like, is it really about rehabilitation or are we kidding ourselves?
It's a question people have been grappling with for, well, probably as long as prisons have been around, right?
Exactly. And we've got a really interesting perspective to dig into today.
Yeah, Darren Gee's story.
Yeah, he's a former prisoner himself, and he does not hold back on what he thinks needs to change.
And that's what makes his story so powerful. He's
Yeah.
been there, experienced it firsthand. So when he talks about the need for reform, you know it's coming from a place of deep understanding.
Right, so let's start with, like, who is Darren Gee? Why should we listen to this guy?
So Gee spent years navigating the prison system, saw it all, lived it. It wasn't theoretical for him, it was his reality.
And he's very clear, it sounds like, that he doesn't think it's working the way it should.
Oh, he's definitely got strong opinions about that. He really paints this picture of prison as like this pressure cooker. You've got all these different personalities, different offenses all thrown together.
And that can't be good for anyone, right? I mean, talk about a recipe for, I don't know, making things worse instead of better.
Exactly. He uses this analogy of a prison wing being like a house, but like a jam-packed house with 30 people all crammed in.
Okay, I get it. And not just any 30 people, right?
Right. People convicted of all sorts of crimes, from petty theft to, much more serious stuff. He argues that kind of environment, especially for someone who's young and impressionable,
Yeah, someone just starting out in the system.
it can be really detrimental. He even says it's like leading a mouse to the lions.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly a recipe for rehabilitation then. So what does he think we should be doing differently?
Well, he's got some pretty radical ideas, and one of the big ones is this concept of categorizing prisons by the type of crime committed instead of just by risk level.
So instead of like low, medium, high security, you'd have a prison for, say, drug offenders, another one for violent offenders, and so on.
Exactly.
I can see how that could be controversial. On the surface, it seems kind of counterintuitive. Like, aren't we already labeling people enough in the criminal justice system?
That's a valid concern for sure. And we'll definitely get into the potential drawbacks and challenges of his idea, but let's stick with the potential benefits for now.
Okay, so walk me through his reasoning here. What's the upside, in his view?
So, G believes that by separating inmates by the types of crimes they committed, it could actually minimize some of the negative influences that can run rampant in prison, especially for those who are younger and more vulnerable.
Okay, so instead of a young first-time offender being thrown into a mix with hardened criminals, they'd be grouped with others who committed similar offenses.
Right. And the idea is that it would allow for more targeted rehabilitation programs, too.
That makes sense. Could you elaborate on that a bit? What do you mean by more targeted programs?
Well, take drug offenders, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a prison specifically for them, the focus of the rehabilitation programs could be on things like addiction recovery, job training, really addressing the root causes that might have led them to drug-related crimes in the first place.
So it's about tailoring the rehabilitation to the specific needs and challenges faced by that particular group of offenders, rather than this one-size-fits-all approach. It's interesting, though, Gee's ideas about prison reform, they don't come from some, like, academic theory or anything. He's drawing a direct line between his own childhood, his own experiences, and how he ended up in the system in the first place.
Right, he talks about this really traumatic event where his brother actually set fire to their house when they were kids.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the fire itself, right? That's obviously a huge deal, but then social services got involved.
Which, as you can imagine, just added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation.
Totally. And it ultimately led to G and his brother being separated from their family and put into the care system.
And this is where things take another turn, because the place Guy was sent to, Lanky Treehouse, it doesn't sound like it was a particularly supportive or nurturing environment.
He really doesn't sugarcoat it. He talks about the challenges he faced there, and you can almost hear this unspoken question. Like, did the system that was supposed to be helping him actually do more harm than good?
This is a question that hangs over a lot of these stories, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about the experiences of young people within the care system. And in B's case, it's even more complicated because his brother ended up in a secure unit, which suggests things escalated pretty seriously for him as well.
It's heartbreaking, really, because you can't help but wonder if they'd had different support systems in place, could things have gone differently for them?
It's that what if that's so frustrating. And it brings us to this bigger issue that G talks about a lot, the school-to-prison pipeline. Maybe we should unpack that a bit for our listeners who aren't familiar with the term.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those phrases that gets thrown around a lot, but it's important to really understand what it means.
Basically, it refers to the ways in which certain groups of young people, often from disadvantaged backgrounds, are pushed towards the criminal justice system instead of being given the support they need to succeed.
So it's like this system that's almost designed to funnel them toward prison rather than away from it.
That's a harsh way to put it, but yeah, that's the gist of the criticism. And, gee, having lived it, he's definitely on board with that critique. He talks about how kids who don't fit the traditional mold, the ones who get labeled as naughty or troublemakers,
The ones who don't always follow the rules, maybe they learn a little differently.
right, they often end up shunted aside, almost like the system's just giving up on them. And instead of getting support, maybe in the form of counseling or alternative education programs, they end up in what G calls behavior problem schools.
Which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for success either.
No, and that's Guy's point. He argues that these schools, which are often seen as a last resort, they can sometimes do more harm than good. Instead of addressing the root causes of a child's behavior issues, they can end up just exacerbating them, making those kids feel even more alienated, more like failures.
So these schools, instead of being an alternative to prison, can actually become another step on the path toward it.
Exactly. And it's not just about the schools themselves. It's about the lack of opportunities available to these young people once they leave the education system, even if they do manage to turn things around.
It's like they hit this wall of limited job prospects, societal stigma. The cards are stacked against them.
And that's the cycle that Guy is so desperate to break. Because without access to quality education, job training, some kind of positive support system, it's incredibly difficult for these young people to escape the pull of the criminal justice system.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because Guy's not just like ranting about the problems. He actually offers solutions, like he really wants to see things change.
Yeah, and he goes straight to the source, like he talks directly to parents. And it's powerful, man. He's like, look, I get it. School can be a drag, but trust me, life without an education, it's a whole other level of boring.
Especially when you're stuck in that cycle of unemployment, right? Like, he knows what it's like to feel that lack of purpose, that lack of routine. And he's saying, don't let this happen to your kids.
And you can tell it's not just coming from some theoretical place. It's deeply personal for him. He even throws in some of that classic Darren humor, trying to lighten the mood a bit. He's like, come on, people, stop chatting and listen up.
Yeah, he wants to shake people out of their complacency, make them really hear what he's saying, Like, this isn't just about some abstract problem out there. It has real consequences for real people. But if we circle back to his big idea, his solution, categorizing prisons by crime type, I mean, it's a start, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface here, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even if that specific idea was implemented perfectly, and let's be real, no system is perfect, it's not going to magically erase all the underlying issues that lead to crime in the first place.
Right, like we can't just build our way out of this problem, can we?
Nope. It's about so much more than just the physical structures of prisons. It's about addressing those root causes we keep coming back to, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, those systemic inequalities that are so deeply ingrained in our society.
And that can feel overwhelming, right? Like, where do we even begin to tackle something that big, that complex? But then I think about Guy's story, and it reminds me that it has to start somewhere, right? Every individual story matters, every life that's impacted by these systems.
It creates a ripple effect, and it makes you question, like, what does justice really mean? If the system is actually perpetuating these cycles of crime instead of breaking them, can we really call it just?
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves, and I think Guy's story is a powerful reminder of that. It's a reminder that we can't just turn a blind eye to these issues. So as you go about your day, think about this. What concrete steps can we take, not just as a society, but as individuals, to create a more rehabilitative approach to justice? How can we be part of the solution? Because it's not just about reforming the criminal justice system, it's about creating a more equitable and just society for everyone.
And that's something we all have a stake in.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.